In the autumn of 1979, near the town of Coldwell, Montana, 3 children walked out of the woods. They hadn't been reported missing. No one was looking for them. When a state trooper asked their names, the oldest child, a girl no more than 12, whispered something that made him go pale. She said they were the Dalton children. But according to every record in that county, the Dalton family had no children. They never had. The house where these kids claimed to live had been abandoned for 30 years. And when investigators finally went inside, they found something in the basement, a discovery that would force an entire town to confront a secret they had spent decades trying to bury. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. In the shadow of the Bitterroot Range sits the town of Coldwell, a place where winter comes early and stays late. By 1979, it was barely a town at all. The mines had closed, the families had left. What remained were about 200 people who liked the quiet, who preferred the kind of isolation that keeps questions from being asked. It was the kind of place where you didn't talk about your neighbor's business, and your neighbor returned the favor. But on October 14th, that unspoken agreement shattered. Trooper Daniel Marsh was driving State Route 43 when he saw them. 3 children walking single file along the shoulder of the road. No coats, even though the temperature was already dropping into the 30s. The oldest was a girl with tangled blonde hair and hollow eyes. Behind her, 2 boys, younger, maybe 8 and 6. They moved like shadows. Marsh later said he almost didn't stop. Something about the way they walked felt wrong, like they were sleepwalking, or like they'd forgotten they were supposed to be alive. He pulled over and got out. The kids didn't react. They just kept walking. Marsh had to step in front of them to make them stop. When he asked where they were going, the girl looked past him toward the mountains and said they were going home. Marsh asked where home was. The girl pointed back the way they'd come toward the old service road that led deep into the woods. That's when Marsh noticed their feet were bare and bleeding. They'd been walking for miles. He radioed in and loaded them into the patrol car. The younger boys didn't speak. They didn't cry. They just stared out the window with expressions Marsh would later describe as emptiness, like something had been scooped out of them. The girl gave her name as Evelyn Dalton. She said her brothers were Thomas and Samuel. Marcia asked where their parents were. Evelyn's answer came in a monotone, like she was reciting something she'd been taught. She said her mother was in the house. She said her father was in the ground, and she said they weren't supposed to leave, but the door had finally opened. Back at the station, Marsh ran the name. Dalton. There were Daltons in the county records, but they were old entries. The most recent was a property deed from 1946, registered to a man named Harold Dalton and his wife Catherine. The house was listed on rural Route 12 about 8 miles into the woods, but there was no mention of children, no birth certificates, no school records, nothing. Marsh called the county clerk, a woman named Phyllis Hargrove, who had lived in Coldwell her entire life. When he said the name Dalton, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Phyllis said something that made Marsh's skin crawl. She said the Daltons didn't have children. She said everyone knew that. Marsh asked what she meant by everyone knew. Phyllis hesitated. And then she said the Daltons had been strange people, kept to themselves, didn't come into town except for supplies. And even then, only Harold ever showed his face. Catherine was never seen after 1948. People assumed she'd left him or died, but no one asked. That was just how things were done. Harold himself had been found dead in 1953, collapsed in his barn. Heart attack, they said. The property had sat empty ever since. No one wanted it. No one even wanted to talk about it. Phyllis said that if these kids were claiming to be Daltons, then someone was playing a sick joke or something much worse was happening. Marsh drove out to the property that same evening. He brought another trooper with him, a younger man named Roy Penner. The road was overgrown, barely passable, trees pressed in on both sides, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even in daylight, it felt like dusk. When they finally reached the house, Marsh's first instinct was to turn around. The place radiated wrongness. It was a 2-story farmhouse, grey and sagging, its windows dark and covered in grime. The porch had collapsed on one side. The door hung open. They went inside. The smell hit them first. Not rot, exactly. Something older. Something that had settled into the walls. The main floor was a wreck. Furniture overturned, covered in dust and animal droppings. But there were signs that someone had been there recently. Footprints in the dust. A pan on the stove with something burned inside. Marsh called out. No answer. They moved through the kitchen, past a hallway lined with photographs so faded you could barely make out the faces. And then they found the door to the basement. It was locked from the outside. A heavy padlock, new, still shining. Penna asked why anyone would lock a basement from the outside. Marsh didn't answer. He just took out his bolt cutters and snapped the lock. The stairs descended into darkness. Marsh's flashlight beam cut through the black, landing on stone walls, slick with moisture. The air was thick, hard to breathe. Penna stayed close behind him, his hand on his service weapon, even though neither of them knew what they were expecting to find. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement opened into a single large room, and that's where they saw it. Mattresses on the floor, 3 of them arranged in a row, blankets that looked like they'd been used recently, empty cans of food stacked in the corner, a bucket in the far end that had been used as a toilet. And on the wall, carved into the stone with something sharp, were names. Evelyn, Thomas, Samuel. But it was what else they found that made Marsh radio for backup. In the corner beneath the top was a trunk. Inside were documents, birth certificates, all handwritten, all dated within the last 12 years. But the mother's name on each one wasn't Catherine Dalton. It was listed as Mary Dalton. The father's name was always Harold Dalton, even though Harold had been dead for 26 years. There were journals, too, dozens of them filled with cramped handwriting. Marsh only read a few pages before he had to stop. They were written by a woman who called herself Mary. She wrote about duty, about bloodline, about keeping the children pure. She wrote about Harold as if he were still alive, as if he were still giving her instructions. And she wrote about the children as if they were not quite human, as if they were something she was cultivating. When the backup arrived, they brought a social worker named Janet Krill. Janet went down into that basement and came back up white as a sheet. She'd worked in child services for 15 years, she said, and she'd never seen anything like it. The children had been living in that basement, not for days or weeks, but for years, maybe their entire lives. There was evidence of a wood stove that had been used for heat. A single bulb hanging from the ceiling, boxes of canned goods that someone had been bringing down regularly. The children had been fed, kept alive, but they'd been kept in the dark. Janet said when she asked Evelyn how long she'd been in the basement, the girl didn't understand the question. She didn't know what a year was. She didn't know what school was. She didn't even know what the son was called. The search expanded. Dogs were brought in. They found a grave about 100 yards from the house, shallow and unmarked. The body inside was a woman, likely in her 40s when she died. Decomposition made identification difficult, but her clothing suggested she'd been buried sometime in the last decade. The coroner would later determine cause of death as malnutrition and untreated infection. Around her neck was a locket with a photo inside. 2 people, a man and a woman. On the back, scratched in tiny letters, were the words Harold and Mary, 1971. But that was impossible. Harold Dalton had been dead since 1953. Unless the man in the photo wasn't Harold at all. The investigation turned to the town itself. Who had known? Who had seen? Who had been bringing food to those children? Someone had to have been keeping them alive. The padlock on the basement door was new, but the routine was old. Those kids had been fed. Their waste had been managed. Their existence had been maintained. This wasn't neglect. This was deliberate. This was a system, and systems don't run themselves. Marsh started interviewing residents. Most claimed ignorance. They said the Dalton property was cursed, that people stayed away from it, but their answers came too quickly, too rehearsed. There was something practiced about the way they shut down questions. One woman, elderly, let something slip. She mentioned that groceries used to go missing from the general store, not stolen, exactly. Paid for, but never picked up. The owner would leave them on the counter and they'd be gone by morning. When Marsh asked who paid for them, the woman caught herself and said she didn't remember, but her eyes said otherwise. The general store owner was a man named Eugene Voss. He was 68, had run the store since 1957. When Marsh confronted him, Eugene's hands shook. He admitted that for years he'd been leaving supplies by the road near the Dalton property every 2 weeks like clockwork. Someone would leave cash in his mailbox, always the exact amount, and he'd leave the supplies. He never saw who took them. He said he didn't want to know. Marsh asked why he'd never reported it. Eugene looked at him like he was stupid. He said, "You don't ask questions in Coldwell. You don't pry. That's how people survive in a place like this." But Eugene wasn't the only one. A trucker named Bill Henry admitted he'd seen lights in the Dalton house over the years. Late at night, passing by on Route 43, he'd seen a figure in the window once, a woman, staring out. He never stopped. A farmer named Ed Pritchard said his dogs would bark in that direction, sometimes all night long, like they sensed something wrong. But no one ever went to check. No one ever called anyone. It was as if the entire town had made an unspoken pact to let whatever was happening in that house simply happen. And when Marsh asked why, he got the same answer from nearly everyone. Because the Daltons were always trouble. Because bad things happened to people who got involved with the Daltons. Because some families carry darkness. And you're better off leaving that darkness alone. The children were taken to a hospital in Missoula, 60 miles away. Doctors examined them and found what you'd expect from kids raised in a basement: vitamin deficiencies, stunted growth, poor muscle development. But it was the psychological damage that disturbed everyone who came into contact with them. Evelyn, Thomas, and Samuel didn't cry. They didn't ask for their mother. They didn't express fear or confusion or relief. They existed in a kind of emotional flatness that one psychologist described as learned dissociation. They had been trained, he said, to not feel, to not question, to simply endure. Evelyn was the only one who spoke in full sentences, but even her speech was strange, formal, old-fashioned. She used words that children don't normally use. She talked about obedience and purity and the importance of the bloodline. When a nurse asked her what she liked to do for fun, Evelyn stared at her blankly and said that fun was not their purpose. Their purpose was to wait. When asked what they were waiting for, Evelyn said they were waiting for father to return. Not their father, just father. As if it were a title, not a relationship. The younger boys barely spoke at all. Thomas would only repeat things Evelyn said. Samuel didn't speak for the first 3 days. When he finally did, it was to ask if they were being punished. A social worker asked him why he thought they were being punished. Samuel said because they had left the house. Because mother had always told them that leaving would bring the darkness. He said the darkness was already coming. He said he could feel it. The investigation into Mary Dalton intensified. Fingerprints from the house were run through every database available. Nothing. No criminal record, no employment history, no social security number. It was as if Mary Dalton had never officially existed. But the journals told a different story. In her own words, Mary described arriving in Coldwell in 1968. She wrote about meeting an old woman who told her about Harold Dalton, about his bloodline, about the duty that had gone unfulfilled when he died. She wrote about being chosen, about being led to the house, about hearing Harold's voice in the walls, telling her what needed to be done. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what would you have done if this was your bloodline. The journals became more disturbing as they went on. Mary wrote about the children as experiments. She documented their development, their obedience, their resistance to cold and hunger. She wrote about keeping them in darkness to make them stronger, to prepare them for what was coming. She never explained what was coming, but she wrote about it constantly: the return, the reckoning, the fulfillment of Harold's vision. In one entry from 1978, she wrote that her body was failing, that she wouldn't live to see the completion of the work. She wrote that she had unlocked the basement door. She wrote that the children would know what to do. And then the entries stopped. The authorities began digging into Harold Dalton's history, trying to understand what kind of man could inspire such devotion decades after his death. What they found was a pattern that stretched back further than anyone had imagined. Harold Dalton had been born in 192, the son of a preacher in a fundamentalist sect that had splintered off from mainstream religion sometime in the 1880s. The sect believed in bloodline purity, in chosen families, in the idea that certain people carried a divine spark that had to be preserved at all costs. Harold's father, Jeremiah Dalton, had been accused of keeping his own children isolated from the outside world, of arranging marriages between cousins, of preaching that the end times would require a pure remnant to rebuild humanity. When Jeremiah died in 1928, Harold inherited the mission. He married Catherine Weaver in 1931, a woman from another family in the sect. They moved to Coldwell in 1946, buying the property with money from the sale of Jeremiah's land back east. Neighbors from that era, the few still alive in 1979, remembered them as cold people. Intense. Catherine had been pregnant at least twice that anyone could recall, but no children were ever seen. When asked about it years later, an elderly woman named Dorothy Chen said everyone assumed the babies had died. Infant mortality was higher back then, she said. But she also said that Catherine had changed after those pregnancies, became withdrawn, stopped coming to town entirely. Dorothy said she'd seen Catherine once through a window in 1947. She said Catherine looked like she'd aged 20 years in two. She said Catherine looked terrified. Catherine disappeared from all records after 1948. No death certificate, no burial record, just gone. Harold continued living in the house alone, at least as far as anyone knew. He was found dead in his barn in 1953, age 51. The official cause was heart failure, but the doctor who signed the death certificate had noted something unusual. Harold's body showed signs of prolonged malnutrition, despite the fact that his pantry was well stocked. His fingers were worn down, the nails destroyed as if he'd been clawing at something. And on his chest, carved into his own flesh with something sharp, was a symbol, a circle with lines radiating outward. The doctor had sketched it in his notes, but never reported it as suspicious. He later told an investigator in 1979 that he'd wanted to forget he'd ever seen it. That same symbol appeared throughout Mary Dalton's journals. She drew it obsessively. She called it the mark of continuation. She wrote that Harold had shown it to her, that he had come to her in dreams and visions, that he had guided her hand when she carved it into the basement wall above where the children slept. When investigators went back to examine the basement more carefully, they found it everywhere. Scratched into the stone, burned into the wooden support beams, traced in what appeared to be dried blood on the underside of the mattresses, and they found something else. Behind a loose stone in the wall, there was a space. Inside that space were photographs, dozens of them, children, different children, spanning decades. On the back of each photo were dates and names. The oldest was from 1933. The most recent was from 1978. A photo of Evelyn, Thomas, and Samuel. The photographs changed everything. They suggested that what happened to Evelyn, Thomas, and Samuel wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of something that had been happening for generations. Investigators tracked down records for some of the names on the back of the photos. Most led nowhere. No birth certificates, no social security numbers, no trace that these children had ever legally existed, but a few led to old missing persons reports. Cases that had gone cold decades ago. Children who had vanished from neighboring counties in the 1930s and 40s. Children whose disappearances had been written off as runaways or abductions, their files buried and forgotten. One photograph stood out. A girl, maybe 10 years old, standing in front of the Dalton house. On the back, in faded ink, it said Catherine, 1912. Investigators cross-referenced it with Catherine Weaver's records. The dates aligned. Catherine hadn't married into this. She'd been born into it, raised in it. And the pregnancies that neighbors remembered, the babies that were never seen, they hadn't died. They'd been hidden, kept in that basement just like Evelyn, Thomas, and Samuel. The pattern became clear. Harold and Catherine had continued what Jeremiah had started. And when they were gone, Mary had taken up the mission. But who had Mary been? Where had she come from? And who would have come after her if she had lived? The town of Coldwell was forced to confront what it had allowed to happen. Town meetings were held. People shouted. People wept. Some admitted they'd suspected something, but had been too afraid to act. Others claimed total ignorance, though their eyes told a different story. A few elderly residents spoke about the old sect, about families that had scattered across Montana and Idaho and Wyoming in the early 1900s, about beliefs that had been passed down like poison through generations. They said the Daltons weren't the only ones. They said there were others in other towns living by the same code, keeping the bloodline pure, waiting for the return. No one wanted to believe it, but no one could prove it wasn't true. Evelyn, Thomas, and Samuel were placed in foster care, separate homes. On the recommendation of psychologists who believed they needed to develop individual identities outside of the family structure that had defined their entire existence, it didn't go well. Evelyn ran away twice trying to find her brothers. Thomas stopped eating, stopped speaking entirely. Samuel screamed at night every night, saying the darkness was coming. Eventually, they were reunited in a specialized group home. They're adults now, in their 50s, living quiet lives under names that aren't Dalton. They've never spoken publicly about what happened. The few people who've maintained contact with them say they still struggle with basic things: trust, affection, the idea that they're allowed to want things for themselves. One caseworker said that Evelyn once told her she still dreams about the basement. She said it felt safer there. She said the world above ground was too bright, too loud, too full of people who didn't understand what it meant to wait. The Dalton house burned down in 1982. No one claimed responsibility. No one investigated too carefully. The property was sold for back taxes and now sits empty. The foundation overgrown with weeds. But people in Coldwell still don't talk about it. They don't talk about the children or the photographs or the symbol carved into Harold Dalton's chest. They've gone back to the old ways. Keep quiet. Mind your business. Don't ask questions because some secrets once buried are meant to stay that way. And some families carry darkness so deep that even after they're gone, it lingers in the soil, in the walls, in the silence of people who knew and did nothing. The Dalton children walked out of those woods in 1979. But what they walked out of, what they were part of, never really ended. It just went back underground, waiting, always waiting for someone else to find it, for someone else to continue the work. And if you listen carefully, if you drive through towns like Coldwell late at night, you might start to wonder how many other families are out there, how many other basements, how many other children hidden away, waiting for a return that will never come. The answer is something most people don't want to know, but it's there in the silence, in the spaces between what people say and what they refuse to say. In the darkness that some families passed down like inheritance, the Daltons are gone. But the evil they served, the evil that used them, it's still out there. Still waiting. Still watching.